Petrodollar is actually a device invented by Kissinger and Nixon.
The standard of living of all Americans can be traced back to here, the vast oil-rich deserts of Saudi Arabia.
In the early 70s, after the Arab crisis happened with the oil embargoes, OPEC basically tripled the price of oil to the Western world. And at that time, America realized that they were vulnerable because they were importing about 70% of all the oil they consumed.
To secure a reliable foreign source of oil, U.S. President Richard Nixon sent his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to Saudi Arabia for a secret meeting. The result was a pact that still stands to this day.
If Saudi Arabia, which at the time was the world's largest producer of oil, would sell the oil in US dollars, America would defend Saudi Arabia and make sure the House Assad would stay in power.
As a direct result of this U.S.-Saudi agreement, all other oil-producing nations also adopted the dollar as the de facto medium of exchange. Demand for it increased exponentially all over the world, and soon it had a new name, the petrodollar.
Your currency is only as strong as the demand for it, just like anything else, the supply and demand. Why the petrodollar is important, it causes a demand for the US dollar. A lot of Americans don't realize that over 70% of all the $100 bills in the world are actually outside of the US. There's more $100 bills in Russia than there are in America.
This stockpile of US dollars in countries around the world is because oil is bought and sold using the greenback.
If oil starts trading in non-petrodollars, such as gold or a basket of currencies, or if China and Russia start trading in yuan and ruble rather than US dollars, that demand isn't there. And the way of life for the average American will be done. It will be worse than the Great Depression.
To date, anyone who's potentially threatened the status of the petrodollar hasn't fared well. Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi publicly pushed for a Pan-African gold-backed currency that he would trade for Libya's oil. He was killed during a US-backed revolution in 2011. And just a few short years before, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein advocated selling oil for euros.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq.
The U.S. invaded under the guise of looking for WMDs.
Iraq did not have any weapons of mass destruction. And interestingly enough, after the Americans invaded, took over, put in their own government, the whole concept of selling oil in euros never surfaced again.
Today, many countries resent the current petrodollar system, and their leading spokesperson is none other than Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Americans should be very worried about what Putin can do. There is a new Cold War going on. It is the Colder War. That is exactly what's going on. And who's in the center of this push? Vladimir Putin. And the petrodollar is so crucial to the Colder War. The only thing holding America right now at the top is the petrodollar. And let me make it very clear. If the petrodollar dies, so does America as a superpower.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about this new world order, sort of, that you actually, Ryan, talked about a little bit yesterday, but there has been a lot of talk in the about the international community coming together against Russia, that Russia miscalculated and perhaps assumed Europe, which is so reliant on their oil and natural gas, that they wouldn't be reacting the way that they are. And now we're seeing Germany, France, and even Switzerland, big bad Switzerland, coming out against Russia and backing various economic measures. But the international community is much larger than the U.S. and Europe. On Friday, the UN Security Council held a vote to condemn Russia. 3 countries abstained: China, India, and the United Arab Emirates. Other countries have also hesitated or refused to condemn or punish Russia, and I want to go over some of these countries. So let's start with China. Now, in early February, China and Russia issued a written pact railing against NATO expansion and calling for a new multipolar world order, stating in this in this document, friendship between the two states has no limits. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation. Xi also said that their joint strategy would have a far-reaching influence on China, Russia, and the world. The statement went on to say that Russia and China stand against attempts by external forces to undermine security and stability in their common adjacent regions, intend to counter interference by outside forces in the international affairs of sovereign countries under any pretext, oppose color revolutions, and will increase cooperation. So they've come together, Russia and China. They've said, our partnership has no bounds. We're going to be partnering in many, many ways. This is going to have a large impact around the world. Not only is it a security cooperation, but it's also economic. 6 days before Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia announced a years-long deal to sell 100 million tons of coal to China, a contract worth more than $20 billion. They're also going to be building pipelines to begin exporting their natural gas to China. Now, let's move on to India here. Despite being the world's largest democracy, India also abstained from condemning Russia. Russia is India's largest arms supplier. Russia's also backed India on UN Security Council resolutions over disputed Kashmir. India did call for an immediate cessation of violence. Like many of these countries are saying, oh, we don't like the violence, but then they don't condemn Russia. Modi called for efforts to return to diplomacy, saying the difference between Russia and the NATO group can only be resolved through honest and sincere dialogue. So even India, this is not this is one of the world's largest democracies, and they've even abstained from condemning Russia. India and China alone, the two economies are massive, lots of people there. So if Europe and the West were to cut off Russia, they just need to turn south and they would be just fine. Now, the United Arab Emirates is also not taking sides. The Emirates views Russia as a close ally in conflicts such as Syria and Libya, two conflicts the U.S. has been on the opposite side of. And UAE buys weapons from Russia. They do a lot of trade with Russia. And it turns out Dubai is a hotspot for Russian tourism. So the UAE has also abstained from condemning Russia. Saudi Arabia is also not condemning Russia. In fact, they're not on the UN Security Council, so they couldn't vote. But the Crown Prince came out saying that they're committed to the OPEC Plus agreement with Russia. And this is probably the worst of all news for Biden in Europe, because basically Saudi Arabia does not intend to increase oil production in order to drive down prices. And as Ryan mentioned yesterday, this is something that the Biden administration had asked of Saudi Arabia. This was even before the invasion of Ukraine. And Saudi Arabia said, no, we're not going to be pumping out more oil in order to reduce prices. And even after the invasion of Ukraine, knowing that the cost of oil is skyrocketing, Saudi Arabia has still come out saying, nah, we still have our deals with OPEC Plus and we're going to maintain those. So this means as prices skyrocket, Russia makes more money, actually. This allows them to better weather these economic sanctions that they're being hit with, but it also means inflation continues. So why would Saudi Arabia side with Russia? Well, they're sick of being snubbed by the U.S. As Ryan also mentioned in his radar yesterday, Obama wouldn't meet with the Crown Prince. Biden has refused to meet with the Crown Prince. Putin has been openly friendly to the Crown Prince, even after Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. We all know that infamous photograph of Putin and the Crown Prince giving each other a high five. So they're friendly with one another, and they have a strong security alliance. They have a strong friendship. And that is something that the United States sort of pushed Saudi Arabia towards Russia by snubbing Saudi Arabia. We also pushed Russia towards China. We might actually live to regret that in a few years when we realize the damage that that's done. By turning on Russia and continuing to propagate Russiagate, Russia has turned itself towards China, and probably to their benefit. Another international player that has abstained, at least originally, from adding their name to the list of countries officially condemning Russia is Israel. Now, when you can't get Israel on your side when you're in the United States, you know you've got a problem. But they've since said that they will add their name, but it's still really kind of unclear what's going on there. But why the flip-flop? People are wanting to know, what's up with Israel? What's up with this flip-flop? Well, Israel sees Russia as a strategic ally, keeping Iran in check in Syria. So they see them as a strategic foreign policy partner at the moment in the Middle East. Also, there's something else going on here that definitely needs to be mentioned, and that is for many Israelis, they actually really like Putin. There's billboards of Putin in Israel. He's a fairly popular figure there, and it's because he represents the Red Army that crushed the Nazis in World War II. And on the flip side, Ukrainians actually stir some very negative memories for the Jewish people in Israel. Many Jews, in fact, 1 million were murdered in the Ukraine by the Nazis and by Ukrainians. So they were slaughtered, and they remember this. So they're feeling this sort of nostalgia towards Putin, not, of course, saying we don't like the violence. Everybody's saying this collectively, but at the same time, they've been very slow, really hesitant, and unwilling to even go against Russia on this. Now, the economic sanctions are going to be hurting Russia, but they've been hit with sanctions, and they've seen others hit with sanctions. So they have prepared for this. And this is kind of one of those things where the United States and the West, in our posturing, in our economic sanctions of Russia, in our going after them, we sort of have this attitude of we're too big to fail. And the reality is these countries have sort of figured out the game plan by now. We've been overusing sanctions, and countries have been able to prepare. So, for example, Russia has vastly increased their domestic production of food and domestic production of their own medicine. They've been preparing for the day that the United States would come after them. China's been doing the same thing, and so have many other nations. Now, the ruble did take a 30% hit yesterday, but Russia's central bank immediately more than doubled its interest rate to heat off the inflation. So meanwhile, price of energy is just going to come at a premium, driving us into a recession. Our economic sanctions against Russia are likely going to backfire. We already have out of control inflation. That's going to drive us into a recession. The central bank then raising interest rates is only going to make it worse. So there's actually a real possibility that we're hurting ourselves more than we're hurting Russia. The economic sanctions, like I mentioned, will hurt Russia, but they've insulated themselves quite a bit. It's not going to kill them. They've seen what's happened in Iran. They've been able to, believe it or not, weather the economic sanctions storm, and Russia's in a better position than Iran to do this. So Russia and China, amongst many others, are looking to replace the U.S. dollar as the world currency. This is a no-brainer. This is obviously what's happening. And if not replace it, at least add another robust option or two, which is what they mentioned in the statement that they put out, saying that they're looking to create a multipolar global world order. And this is looking more and more likely. Now, a lot of people say, no way, there's no way that the dollar is going to be replaced because of the advantages. And the U.S. dollar has had many advantages that has made it the world currency, but those advantages are fading. Limited inflation and depreciation was one of the reasons why the world likes to use the dollar, but that is no longer the case. I mean, inflation right now is no longer limited, nor is it transitory. The economy, our economy is very large. That was one of the other reasons why the world liked to use the U.S. dollar, but China's got a large economy also. And of course, we do have a open market, and that is one of the reasons why the dollar is still being used. But again, it does look like things are potentially flipping. The big thing about this is for one, thinking that the world is coming out against against Russia is not the case, right? There is a greater world than just Europe going on here. And they're opening up their doors and saying, we're not cutting off Russia or China for business. And it's almost like they're seeing the new kid on the block, and they're saying, you guys are kind of old news now. And we want to see what these guys are going to do, because we think they're going to be doing something bigger, and they're going to be insulated. I mean, China in the pandemic was the only economy that actually grew, which raises some suspicions, I think, in a lot of ways with everything that's going on. But I think we're putting ourselves in a really bad position, thinking that we are too big to fail, thinking that we could just do whatever we want, especially with these economic sanctions, and try to crush their economy. They're just going to create another economy, a secondary economy, and that economy is going to grow. So I don't know what the game plan is here, but it doesn't outlook not so good. Just a few hours ago, Medvedev actually came out saying, if these economic sanctions, you're looking for war. China and India alone have all the population, right? I mean, They don't need, once you've got them on your side, you don't need to be worrying about the economic ramifications coming from the United States or Europe, especially if you're thinking you're going to be replacing the U.S. dollar. And the more I look into this, and the more I was kind of seeing the reaction from the rest of the international community with India, the ones I've just mentioned, I don't think this is, I mean, I do think this is about NATO expansion. I do think that that's really upset Putin. I also think this was very planned. And I think we are being very short-sighted thinking that this is just a Ukraine issue. I don't think this is about Ukraine. I think this is about American hegemony. And the more we understand this, that is what they're really taking on, that we're already in World War III. We just don't realize it. Hopefully it doesn't escalate to a nuclear war. But at this point, they're taking us on. That statement, if you read the whole statement that was put out by China and Russia at February 4th, it is ominous. I mean, they're basically saying your days are numbered, guys. It's over. And then they do this. They then forge all of these economic partnerships to one another. And then suddenly Russia goes in and invades Ukraine as if they were going to have a NATO vote tomorrow to bring them in. They weren't. There was nothing really truly that imminent about it. Why did it happen? Because I think these guys planned this out and thought this through. And I think the U.S. dollar has been replaced. We just don't realize it yet. And it's going to be happening a lot sooner than later. Because China was the only one that actually survived the pandemic. So I think everybody's looking at China now and saying, well, actually, they're more stable. And we might, of course, we could say, well, no, their bubble's going to burst and all this. But people are looking at the United States saying the same thing. We've got runaway inflation. We can't even control it. And now what we have to do is say, we're turning off the pipes. We'll turn them back on. But guess what? You have to pay us in gold, gold-backed rubles and yuan.